the Loire Valley, June 13th, 1940. A warm afternoon, the light long and golden over the river, the countryside green and still in the way of early summer. In the city of Tours, inside a prefecture building not designed for what is being decided inside it, two delegations sit across from each other. Telephones malfunction. Government staff move through the corridors with the barely contained urgency of people who know the situation is beyond their control. Outside, the Loire flows wide and slow. A French official named Paul Baudouin is in the room. He will later keep a diary. In that diary, he will write that Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister in France for what will prove to be the last time, had signaled that afternoon that Britain understood. That France could seek peace with Germany, that Britain would not hold France to the promise the two nations had made to each other, that Churchill, in effect, had released France from its word. 12 days later, Churchill stands in the House of Commons. His statement is brief on the point. I see that some accounts have been given of these conversations by the Bordeaux government which do not at all correspond with the facts. We have, of course, a record kept by one of the cabinet secretaries who came with us. Same meeting, same room, same afternoon over the same river. Two accounts, and between them, an irreconcilable gap. What did Churchill say when France asked for permission to seek peace with Germany? The answer has never been simple, and why it hasn't. Why a single disputed conversation in a Loire Valley prefecture sits at the intersection of armistice and resistance, of Vichy France and Free France, of everything that followed, is the subject of what comes next. On March 28, 1940, in London, the governments of Britain and France signed a mutual agreement. Its language was deliberate and specific. Neither country would negotiate nor conclude an armistice or treaty of peace except by mutual agreement. They further undertook, after the war, to maintain a community of action for as long as necessary. The two men most invested in that commitment were Winston Churchill, not yet Prime Minister but soon to be, and Paul Reynaud, who had taken the French premiership weeks earlier. They were not close friends. What they shared was a conviction that Germany under Hitler was not a negotiating partner. It was an existential threat. Reynaud had argued for mechanized warfare while France's military establishment ignored him. Churchill had warned about Hitler throughout the 1930s, while Britain's political class looked the other way. Each had spent a decade being told he was wrong. In 10 weeks, France will ask to be released from the March Promise. May 10th, 1940. Germany invades the Low Countries. The French had placed their confidence in the Maginot Line along the German border and in the assumption that the dense Ardennes forest to their right was impassable. Both assumptions are wrong. German armor threads the Ardennes while the main Allied force rushes north into Belgium. The Meuse is crossed on May 13th. German tanks cover 150 miles in 4 days. By May 21st, panzer divisions have already reached the coast at Abbeville. The British Expeditionary Force and two French armies are cut off in a shrinking pocket in the north. The road to the Channel is open. The road to Paris is open. On the morning of May 15th, the phone call comes. Churchill has been Prime Minister for 5 days, appointed on the morning the invasion began. The voice on the line is Reynaud's. "We have been defeated," he says. "We are beaten. We have lost the battle. The front is broken near Sedan." Churchill tries to recall every precedent, every time in the last war that German armor broke through, every time the line was restored. Reynaud is not consoled. There is something in his voice that is not panic and not grief. It is the flat tone of a man reporting a fact. Churchill flies to Paris the next morning. The Quai d'Orsay courtyard is full of smoke. Officials are feeding documents into bonfires. The French government is burning its archives. Before any formal surrender, before any armistice, the French state is already preparing for evacuation. Churchill watches the smoke rise. Inside, he meets the French commanders. He asks the question that must be asked: where is the strategic reserve? In the last war, Paris was saved by a mobile force rushed to the front at the critical moment. There must be such a force now. Where is it? General Maurice Gamelin looks at him. Aucune. None. There is no reserve, no plan, nothing held back. Churchill will later write that he had never, in all his years in government, received so devastating an answer. He absorbs it. He keeps going. By the end of May, Operation Dynamo evacuates 338,000 British and French soldiers from the beaches at Dunkirk, a figure that will be called miraculous. And that is, in fact, the largest military defeat Britain has suffered in a generation. The army is safe. Its equipment is gone. France is not finished, but the machinery of its finishing is now in motion. Here is what is happening in London at the same time. On May 25th, while Dunkirk is still being evacuated, Churchill's war cabinet convenes in the cabinet room at number 10. Sitting across from him is the Foreign Secretary, Edward Frederick Lindley Wood, 1st Earl of Halifax. A tall man, well over 6 feet, with a gaunt face, deep-set eyes, and the quiet bearing of an Oxford-educated aristocrat who has governed an empire and could have been Prime Minister. In May 1940, the King very much wanted him to be. He is not a fool, and what he is about to say deserves to be heard as seriously as Churchill hears it. Halifax makes his case. Britain is watching its ally collapse. America is not coming. The British Expeditionary Force is pinned against the Channel. Italy has not yet entered the war. If Mussolini can be approached as an intermediary, a neutral broker, there may be terms available. Terms under which Britain retains its independence, under which the empire survives, under which the killing stops. Halifax is not, he says, advocating surrender. He's advocating rational calculation. Britain might retain its freedom at the cost of a few former German colonies and Nazi dominance over continental Europe. By the observable facts of late May 1940, it is a case that cannot simply be dismissed. Churchill's reply does not dismiss it. He engages it. Peace and security might be achieved under a German domination of Europe. He tells the War Cabinet that we could never accept. We must ensure our complete liberty and independence. We must oppose any negotiations which might lead to a derogation of our rights and power. The exchange is not resolved on May 25th. It continues across 3 more days of War Cabinet meetings, Halifax returning each time with the patience of a man who believes the evidence is on his side. Churchill is not certain he will survive this. His position depends on the support of Neville Chamberlain, the former Prime Minister, whose appeasement policy Churchill spent years opposing. If both Chamberlain and Halifax move against him, Churchill falls. He knows it. What Halifax could not calculate, what nobody in that room could calculate, was that Churchill's refusal to negotiate would eventually force Hitler's attention east, that the Soviet Union would absorb a blow that might have broken Britain, that America would enter the war. None of those things exist yet in May 1940. They are bets. Churchill is placing them with other people's lives, and he knows that too. On May 28th, Churchill calls in the outer cabinet, 25 ministers outside the inner circle, and speaks to them directly. If at last this long story is to end, he tells them, it were better it should end, not through surrender, but only when we are rolling senseless on the ground. The response breaks across the room. Men crowd forward. Some weep. Some grip his arm. The momentum shifts. Chamberlain sides with Churchill. Halifax's challenge deflates, not with a resignation, not with a scene, but with the quiet collapse of an argument that has run out of room. Within weeks, Halifax will be dispatched to Washington as British ambassador, a prestigious posting, a decisive removal. Churchill never fights that battle again. June 11th. The French government has fled Paris. Churchill flies south to meet the French leadership at the Château du Muguet near Briare, a country house now serving as Weygand's headquarters. The meeting has the quality of a final act. Churchill urges the French to fight on, from Brittany, from North Africa, through anything that keeps the war alive. General Weygand is frank. The battle is lost. A cessation of hostilities is not a preference, but a compulsion. The French armies are fragmenting. Marshal Pétain, 84 years old, white-haired, carrying the composed authority of a man who believes he is being asked to preside over unnecessary destruction, sits in firm resistance to everything Churchill proposes. Edward Spears has been Churchill's liaison officer for months. At Briare, something becomes clear to him that he cannot quite name. The Battle of France was over, he will write later, and no one believed in miracles. He watches Churchill make the argument one more time. The North Africa option, the guerrilla option, the moral case that fighting on costs less than surrendering, and watches the French commanders listen with the attentive silence of men who have already decided. That evening, the French government moves further south. The next meeting, wherever it is, will be the last. June 13th. Tours. The prefecture building is not built for what it is being asked to hold. The room is designed for regional administration. Telephones keep failing. Staff move without clear authority. The British delegation is substantial. Churchill, Halifax, Beaverbrook, Cadogan, Ismay, Spears. Reynaud is there, with Paul Baudouin beside him and other members of the War Committee. General Spears notices immediately that something has shifted since Briare. It was like a business meeting, he will write, with the British keenly appraising the situation from their own point of view. The warmth is gone. The shape of what is coming has already settled into the room. Outside, Hélène de Portes, Reynaud's mistress, whose influence over the Prime Minister his allies despised and his enemies exploited, is trying to force her way in. A French naval officer ends it. "Get that woman out of here for the dignity of France." She is removed. It will emerge later that on this same day, Reynaud threw 2 glasses of water at de Portes after finding a missing government telegram in her bed. Inside, Reynaud speaks. He describes the front, the army, what Weygand has told him, what the defeatist faction has been saying. Then he asks the question, will Britain release France from the March 28th agreement? The promise that neither country would seek a separate armistice without the other's consent. He is asking, plainly, will you let us go? The British cabinet record, kept by a secretary present in the room, states that Churchill declared Britain would fight on whatever happened. He expressed understanding of France's position. He did not agree to release France from the March promise. Paul Baudouin writes something different. In his diary, Baudouin records that Churchill had signaled that Britain would not hold it against France were France to stop fighting. That Churchill had, in effect, accepted the principle of a separate armistice. Baudouin is not peripheral. He is in the room. His diary is among the most detailed primary sources for this period, and what he claims Churchill said would mean, if true, that France's path to the armistice was at least partly paved by the belief that Britain had accepted it, that some members of the French cabinet voted for surrender, believing they had British consent. Churchill, 12 days later in the House of Commons, is flat and unequivocal. The accounts given by the Bordeaux government, he says, do not at all correspond with the facts. There is something else about that room. Reynaud's telephone had been tapped on Weygand's instructions. His private conversations were being monitored by his own general. The Prime Minister of France, in his final days of power, was trying to hold the line with Churchill while the defeatist faction was dismantling it beneath him. He was not simply conveying his government's position. He was a man whose coalition had already made a decision without him. The meeting ends. Churchill flies back to London. The French ministers, whom Reynaud had promised would speak with Churchill before the British left, are never brought in. Spiers is despondent. He writes afterward that an opportunity that might not recur had been missed. Whether Reynaud forgot or could not face the explanation, the effect is the same. A cabinet full of men who feel abandoned, voting in the days that follow with that feeling still on them. Whether what Baudouin recorded was accurate, convenient, or something between the two, that question has traveled through 85 years of historical scholarship without a definitive answer. What remains is the gap between the two versions and the weight that gap carries. June 15th, London. In the previous 48 hours, someone has conceived an idea so extraordinary that it briefly defies the gravity of everything around it. The proposal: Britain and France dissolve into a single nation. Not an alliance, not a treaty, a union. One government, one citizenship, one war cabinet. The two countries ceasing to be two countries. Jean Monnet drafts it. Charles de Gaulle, newly appointed Under-Secretary of State for National Defense, 49 years old, nearly 6.5 feet of composed military bearing, arrives in London, reads the draft, and understands immediately what it is. This could give Reynaud what he needs: the courage to move the government to North Africa, to refuse the armistice on French soil and continue the war from outside metropolitan France. "I am here to save the honor of France," he reportedly tells Monnet's wife. Churchill brings the Union proposal to Cabinet on June 16th. It is approved. The message is telephoned to Reynaud in Bordeaux. The French Cabinet rejects it 13-6. Pétain calls it a merger with a corpse. The man whose country is 4 days from signing an armistice with Germany declines the offer of union with the country still willing to fight. Churchill, the same man who had just spent 3 weeks fighting Halifax on the principle that Britain must not compromise its independence, had offered to dissolve British sovereignty to keep France in the war. France's cabinet chose to offer France to Germany instead. That same afternoon, the British cabinet convenes on France's formal request for release from the March Agreement. The reply is conditional. Britain consents to France asking what armistice terms might be available, provided the French fleet sails immediately to British ports and remains there during any negotiations. The condition is specific. It is unambiguous. It is written down. Churchill boards a train. He is headed for a British cruiser off the Brittany coast, where he is to meet Reynaud for one final attempt. The plan, the Union proposal, the conditional consent, all of it is still in motion. Then the telegram arrives. Paul Reynaud is gone. Marshal Pétain has formed a new government. The dispatch from the British ambassador in Bordeaux makes the purpose plain. A government formed for the prime purpose of seeking an armistice with Germany. The cabinet had voted 13-6. Reynaud was not overthrown. He was simply outnumbered by a faction that had been doing the work while he was trying to hold the line. Churchill's train does not move. June 21st. Compiègne Forest, northeast of Paris. Hitler has selected the location with precision. The same clearing, the same railway carriage, removed from a museum and placed exactly where it stood on November 11th, 1918, when Germany surrendered and the First World War ended. Hitler takes the same chair in which Marshal Foch sat when he faced the representatives of a defeated German empire. He listens to the preamble read aloud. Then, in a gesture of calculated disdain, he rises and exits the carriage, as Foch had done, leaving his generals to conduct the remainder. American correspondent William Shirer stands 50 yards away. He watches Hitler's face. "I am but 50 yards from him," he writes in his dispatch. "I've seen that face many times at the great moments of his life. But today, It is afire with scorn, anger, hate, revenge, triumph. Churchill reads the armistice terms when they become available. He reaches Article 8. The French fleet is to be collected in specified ports and immobilized under German or Italian control. The condition is not met. The fleet does not sail. Britain had given consent in a message that made the condition explicit and unambiguous. France signed the armistice as though that condition had never been written. Churchill will later say it was with grief and amazement that he read Article 8. The following month, he orders the Royal Navy to confront the French fleet at Mers el-Kébir, off the Algerian coast, to present the French commander with a set of choices that are, in different ways, versions of the same ultimatum. The ultimatum is refused. The guns open fire. More than 1,000 French sailors die. Churchill calls it the most unnatural and painful decision in which he had ever been concerned. From London, June 18th. Charles de Gaulle, whom Reynaud had sent to London on a signed military mission, who stayed when there was no longer a Reynaud government to return to. Broadcasts on the BBC. The government of France has sentenced him to death in absentia. The official France has signed the armistice and recognized Pétain's authority. De Gaulle speaks to the French people as though none of that were final, as though an armistice were not the end of a country, but merely the end of one chapter in a longer war. One man, a borrowed microphone, and a refusal to accept that the story is over. Churchill told Anthony Montague Brown in later years that after 1940, after France's breaking of a solemn agreement not to sue for a separate peace, he never felt the same about them. The man who flew to Paris when the archives were burning, who sat in a war cabinet for 3 days fighting Halifax, who proposed to dissolve the British state into a union with France to keep France in the war, who then had to order the Royal Navy to fire on French ships when the one condition he had set was ignored. He never felt the same about them. 4 years later, Allied forces were fighting through Normandy, through Paris, through the roads and towns of a France that had spent 4 years under German occupation. The railway carriage at Compiègne was gone, destroyed in the final years of the war. The man who had placed it there so precisely, who had calculated the exact position, the exact chair, the exact ceremony of his revenge, was dead in a Berlin bunker. The bet had paid out. What Churchill said at Tours has never been fully resolved. What he did before and after is the record.